Okay. I think we'll begin and the other will arrive. Anyway, this session will be recorded and available in our YouTube channel. So if you want to share it after all with your colleagues, don't hesitate. It will be available very shortly after this session. We are here today to discuss about biodiversity data for financial actors. We'll discuss about a lot of different topics such as Article 29, but also TNFD. And we'll also re-explain a bit the fundamental of BIA-GBS methodology. We are here with Julie Bonnet from CDC Biodiversity, and we will be joined by Amundi with one of the representatives that have worked on the TNFD pilot with Carbon4 Finance and CDC Biodiversity. We might go on the next slide, please, Julie. Perfect. Sandrine is here as well. Okay.
Yes, so sorry for being late.
No problem. We just began, so no problem at all. So in the first part, we will introduce to you a bit like the partnership between CDC Biodiversity and Carbon4 Finance. And we will re-explain a bit like our expertise and how we have co-constructed this database and how it differs from the other actors. We deep dive into more specific methodological explanation in the second part, and more we'll have a focus on reporting frameworks such as French Article 29 and the TNFD pilot at the end with Amundi and Sandrine to have the feedback also on the financial institution side. So if we begin a bit with the partnership history, it has been now more than, I would say, 2.5 3 years that we are working together between Carbon4 Finance and CDC Biodiversity. So as a reminder, Carbon4 Finance is a climate and biodiversity data provider, part of a group called Carbon4, which have more than 16 years of expertise on that topic. And on the other end, with CDC Biodiversity, they also have 16 years of experience on the biodiversity topic. So when we decided at Carbon4 Finance level to develop a new database on biodiversity, it was very important for us to partner with what we believe, I will not say the best, but at least one of the main actors on the market that share the same values as us, such as a scientific, transparent, open source approach. CDC Biodiversity and Carbon4 Finance publish a lot on our respective websites about our methodologies. The fact that we want to have a direct discussion between the financial actors and the sectorial experts to have a maximizing impact and explanation on the know-how of the methodology. And really what we do is to customize and adapt the database to the client needs, and the TNFD pilot will be a good example on that part. So if we go on the next slide, to take a step back, Carbon4 Finance has developed 3 databases. The first one on climate, so on transition risk, where we calculate the scope 1, the scope 2, the scope 3, induced, avoided emission. We have a second one, which is on physical risk, called CRIS, and the third one, which we have co-developed, called BIA-GBS. Our true expertise at Carbon4 and Carbon4 Finance is the bottom-up approach. And I will take a few seconds to explain how we calculate for the bottom-up approach for climate, for example, a few metrics, because it has an importance for biodiversity. As you probably all know here, that in biodiversity, one of the main pressure is climate change. Hence, the quality of the data on climate change matter a lot also for biodiversity and for BIA-GBS. So what we call a bottom-up approach means that we collect physical information from annual report, mainly if it is a listed company, but we do sometimes also for non-listed company on other type of pilots. And we recalculate for the scope 1, the scope 2, and the scope 3, the emission. And the big question is how, because if it was so easy, it would be done always. But the big point is that when you want to recalculate emission, you need to have what we call an emission factor. So if we take an example of automobile manufacturers such as Toyota, what we will do is that we will have, for example, the number of electrical car, the number of diesel car, the number of hybrid car, and we will apply a different emission factor for each one of the production. And we'll go one step further and we'll look, for example, if Toyota sold X amount of electric car in China or in France or in the UK, because we know that the usage of the car and the electric car is not the same depending on the energy mix. So we have a huge library of emission factor within Carbon4 Finance, which allow us to have the full Scope 3 recalculated upstream and downstream. And all of this type of metric is also what we want to leverage for biodiversity. So we have this pressure that we use, but also the raw data that can be used as well to enhance BI-GBS. So if we go on the next slide, what we can see is that we work with a lot of different type of actors, be it on the climate side with asset manager, asset owners, banks, central banks, private banks, index provider. And if we deep dive on the next slide on the specific topic of biodiversity, we work with Amundi here, representing the asset management side, but we work also with banks such as ING, with group such as Crédit Mutuel, which use all of the data for all of the different work, be it for insurance, for asset management, or for banking purposes. And we accompany the actors for reporting as well, for Article 29, but also for stewardship, for pilots, for TNFD, and all of that will be discussed in the next slide.
So, thank you, Melissa. Just as Melissa has done, I'm going to present just a little bit about CDC Biodiversité. So CDC Biodiversité is a subsidiary of the Caisse des Dépôts, which is the largest French public financial institution. And so there are a little bit different activities done by this company. So the core activity was long-term restoration and ecological management. And this allowed us to have really an experience in biodiversity restoration and ecological management. But we also have activities in training, research, and also studies and engineering. And in these few polls, we created the GBS. So the GBS is a biodiversity footprinting tool. The goal is to measure the biodiversity footprint of companies and financial institutions. And so this project was started around 2015. And then we were able to launch the tool in 2020. And then in 2021, we launched the database BIA-GBS in partnership with Carbon4 Finance. And so at CDC Biodiversity, we have a club, so it's called the B4B Plus Club, which is a club for companies and financial institutions. The goal of this club is really to have feedback, to be able to exchange between the members on best practices, experiences, and the different pilots that are tested within this club. And so you can see here we have a lot of corporates, financial institutions, but also consultants, which are members of this club, and the goal is really to share best practices. And finally, for a little bit for the context of CDC Biodiversity, so in terms of reporting, we are really integrated into the global framework. So today we are going to talk about TNFD and Article 29, for example, but also in terms of methodology, we are really invested in different projects such as Align to align methodologies on biodiversity footprinting, but we also give feedback to the SBTN, Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, etc., etc. And finally, for this introduction, I'm going to let Melissa speak about the age of our services.
So as a summary, if you look at the different type of instruments or asset classes that you might need to look at for biodiversity, here is a summary of what we can propose for climate, be it for transition risk, physical risk, and for biodiversity. So what you can look at is that with CDC Biodiversity, we have offers for all the different kind of needs you might have. We have, for BI-GBS, for example, listed corporate and sovereign already assessed for impact and for dependencies. We are collectively working a lot also for private debt actors and for banks to assess their loan book. And on CDC Biodiversity side, they have also expertise on real estate, infrastructure, and also, of course, directly for corporate, which can be interesting as well if you're accompanying company on their, I would say, transition plan for biodiversity as well.
Thank you. And so now that you have a little bit more about the context, what is the database, etc., I'm going to present to you the methodology behind the database, both on the impact side and on the dependency side. So just to start and to be able to understand it better, the GBS is the Global Biodiversity Score. So it's a tool, a biodiversity footprinting tool. And the BIA-GBS is the database based on the tool. The idea is that you have both the GBS tool and input data from Carbon4 Finance. And so in the BIA-GBS database, you combine the two and you obtain impacts and dependencies of listed assets and sovereign bonds. So the first part would be about the impact. So what is our methodology? What can you expect when you use the BIA-GBS database? And the second part is on the dependency side to really have this double materiality approach. So first on impact, here you have the four main key features of the tool. They will all be a little bit more precise in the next slides, but here you have a recap. And so first, the first important key feature is the metric. So we use the MSA square kilometer to measure impact on biodiversity, which is the impact on the ecosystem integrity. The second key feature is the concept of scopes. So using the concept of scopes, we are able to distinguish the impact on the whole value chain of a company or a portfolio. The third feature is the concept of dynamic and static impact. So it's really a concept specific to biodiversity, and I will talk a little bit more about this on the next slides. And finally, the next feature is this pressure impact relationship. So the GBS assesses the impact by modeling pressures on ecosystem, and these pressures are then converted into impacts on biodiversity. So to start with the metric, so we use the mean species abundance, or MSA, to evaluate the ecosystem integrity. So the MSA is a metric on a scale from 0% to 100%. 100% being 100% of remaining biodiversity, meaning a totally undisturbed ecosystem. You have here some example on the left of the slide. So for example, a pristine forest or a totally undisturbed pasture. And then as you are disturbing the ecosystem, the MSA drops, and an MSA of 0% would be 0% of remaining biodiversity, meaning, for example, a totally lifeless parking lot. And so you have this figure in MSA, which represents a loss or gain of biodiversity. And in the database, BIA-GBS, we express results in MSA square kilometer. So it's a multiplication between this biodiversity loss or gain in MSA and the impacted surface in square kilometer. And so it gives you both a vision of the ecosystem condition thanks to the MSA and the ecosystem extent thanks to the square kilometer. And so the most important thing of this slide is this on the bottom left corner. So it's the idea that an impact of 1 MSA square kilometer is equivalent to the total destruction of 1 square kilometer of undisturbed natural ecosystem. So going from an MSA to 100% to 0% on 1 square kilometer. And so all of the results on the database will be expressed in MSA square kilometer. And on the right, you have an example of calculation. If you go on 100 square kilometer from an MSA of 100% to 30%, you have an overall impact of 70 MSA square kilometer. So that was the first key concept. And the second one is the concept of scopes. So the idea here is just to say to you that we use the same concept of scopes as in climate footprinting. And so you can see here that our value chain boundaries are compatible with the GHG protocol and therefore will be compatible with everything that you're doing on the climate side. And so we are able to distinguish the impacts between the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 upstream and downstream impacts. And so finally, in terms of key features, I spoke a little bit about this distinction between static and dynamic impact. So this distinction is really key for biodiversity because we have already crossed the planetary boundary related to biodiversity, meaning that decreasing our future impacts will not be sufficient. We also need to decrease our past impacts, and that's what this distinction between static versus dynamic can be helpful for. So first, on the left, you can see the static impact. So the static impact is the state of biodiversity at the beginning of the assessment, meaning your accumulated negative impact. You can see here in the slide, for example, it's the size of this field, which has been here since a long time and therefore exerts a constant pressure on biodiversity. And then on the right, you have the dynamic impact, which is the additional impact during the period assessed. So typically it's a period of 1 year. And so meaning that during this year, your impact on biodiversity has increased because this field is now bigger than it was before. And so it's really a key feature of the tool, and you will see the results on the database are expressed both in terms of static impact versus dynamic impact to give you this view of both your past cumulated impact, but also your additional impact each year. And finally, in terms of key features, you have the concept of pressures. So the idea is that we cannot directly measure impacts on biodiversity because it would require ecological surveys and exhaustive ecological surveys, and it's really time consuming and really expensive. So we use the concept of pressures, which is that activities have pressures on biodiversity, and these pressures create impacts. And you can see here which pressures are covered with our tool. So in terms of IPBES pressures, we now cover 4 of these 5 pressures. So we cover land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change and pollution. And in terms of ecosystems, for now, we cover 2 of the 3 ecosystems. So we cover terrestrial and freshwater impacts, and we do not yet cover the marine ecosystem. And so here you can see that we actually use sub-pressures of these IBES pressure. For example, we're able to distinguish between the impacts coming from land use, fragmentation, encroachment, but also climate change, wetland conversion, etc. So these are all the key concepts of the tool. And in order to better understand how it works, you have here an overall view of the functioning of the GBS tool. So the idea here is that we can use different type of data in order to calculate the impact at the end in MSA square kilometer. And on this slide, you have an overview of all the different types of data that can be injected into the model. So if we start from the left, the first type of data that we can use is financial data, so turnover by sector and by country. You have on the bottom of the slide an example, so it would be financial data in euros, for example. Then from this financial data, we convert them into inventories using the ExIO-based input-output models, meaning that we obtain tonnages of commodities. For example, you can see here on the bottom tonnages of corn. With these inventories, we convert them into pressures using in-house tools. And the idea here is to obtain pressures on biodiversity, for example, land occupation with the size of the occupation and also the intensity. And finally, the next step is to obtain impacts in MSA square kilometer. So we convert these pressures into impacts using the GloBio model. And practically what this means for BIA-GBS, you have here the different input data that we use for the database BIA-GBS. So first, we use 2 types of data. We use financial data, so turnover by sector and by country. This data is provided by Carbon4 Finance and comes from the CRIS database that Melissa presented earlier. And the second type of data is GHG emissions. So these GHG emissions come from the CIA database of Carbon4 Finance. And so the idea is that at company level, you have company-specific emissions calculated using a bottom-up approach. And so these are the input data into the GBS, and then at the end, you see on the bottom right, you obtain a result, so impacts in MSA square kilometer distinguished by terrestrial, aquatic, but also dynamic and static compartments. So this was the overall methodology for the impact. But as I said, we also offer a dependency calculation. The idea is really to be aligned with the current frameworks in terms of regulations, etc., that demand a double materiality approach, meaning to consider both impacts on biodiversity, but also dependencies on biodiversity. And so we are able to calculate dependencies on biodiversity of the different companies in the BIA-GBS database. You have here an overview of how it works. The idea is to obtain a dependency score. So this score ranges from 0% to 100%, with 0% being no known dependency and 100% being a very high dependency to ecosystem services. So the results are also distinguished between the direct dependencies, so scope 1 dependencies, and also the dependencies of the upstream value chain, because these two types of dependencies can be very different depending on the sector considered. And so at the end, we are able to measure the dependency on 21 ecosystem services that you can see here on the slide. And the idea is to obtain a graph like this for each company and also for your portfolio, for example, with the main sectors of your portfolio and the 21 ecosystem services. And so you have the dependency from 0 to 100 of these sectors on these ecosystem services. And in terms of score, we use two types of scores. These two scores are complementary and allow you to have different views of your dependencies. So first, we provide an average dependency score, which is really the average dependency of a company on all ecosystem services. But then to give you a complementary view, we also have a critical dependency score, which was developed this year. And so this critical dependency score is a share of a company or a portfolio, which is critically dependent, meaning a very high dependency on at least one ecosystem service. And it allows you to flag the high dependencies on your direct operation, but also in your upstream value chain. And here you have the overall methodology. The idea is that we use, once again, data from the CRIS database of Carbon4 Finance to obtain the sector of activities of the company. We are then able to obtain the sector of activities of its value chain using the XIO-based input-output model. We map these those two processes, and finally we use the Encore database to obtain the dependencies of these processes. And so at the end you have two dependency scores, so critical and average, for both scope 1 and upstream dependencies. So this was the overall methodology of the tool, both for impacts and dependencies. We have a little time for a Q&A at the end if you have some questions, but for now I'm going to let Melissa present to you what we can do for Article 29.
Thank you very much, Julie, for the presentation of the BIA-GBS methodology and the pillar of the methodology. So as you already know, the French Article 29 of the Loi énergie-climat requires as well, since now more than 2 years, that you publish some data on biodiversity. So if we deep dive on what is requested by the regulation, we can see that there are some part of the what is requested, which is really linked to your strategy, so your governance, the means that you have to contribute to a transition, the ESG governance, the engagement strategy, voting policy, etc., which is on your side linked to the strategy that you have. But there are also some part of what is requested from Article 29, which is linked to data, and this is where we can really help you. So for the number 5, 6, 7, and 8, the different database that we have, so the CA database, the CRIS database, and the BIA-GBS database, answer the different needs that the Article 29 requests. And what we do for the client is really to debunk the Article 29 requirements and to explain each time the link between what is written within the Article 29 and how you can answer it via our data. To give you an idea, if we help a client for the full Article 29, so climate and biodiversity, the report we produce is of 90 pages, because each time for each data, we have the portfolio aggregate results, the top, the flop, the different explanation of the indicators, the explanation of the methodology, and always the link with Article 29. On this topic, if you are interested, don't hesitate to write it, but we also have done a specific webinar on this topic with the Treasury last year. And we'll do another one this year on this topic specifically as well. So it might help you also to see more clearly what is expected. And there is also the ADEM platform, or the Climate Transparency Hub, where you can see everything that has been reported as well. If we go on the next slide to explain a bit more practically, how does it work? So let's say that, so it was for 2023, but it's the same for 2024. Let's say that you want to do reporting for Article 29. What we can do, it's in maximum 4 weeks to really provide to you all of the different data that you need for the different databases in the format that you need to report, but also with the reporting. So we have the full slide deck with the explanation that we provide to you. There is the first part when you provide to us your inventory, and we will do the onboarding with your team, explaining the methodology. So we have a few hours with CDC Biodiversity on biodiversity and with our research team internally on climate to explain to you like the different methodology, the different data, the different indicators. Then between 2 and 4 weeks, we provide to you the results. We have a presentation of the results with your team. So it can be you, but it can also be with sometimes the fund manager, with the ESG direction, etc., etc. And then we have, after usually 1 or 2 weeks, a lot of different questions on how and why and how and what, etc. And it's very important, this phase of Q&A. And we are at your disposal to answer the question you might have on the results, because at the end, it's your publication, your Article 29. So it's normal that you want and you have to be comfortable with the data you receive and the methodology that you are going to use. So if we go on the next slide to look a bit at the value proposition, there is one part on training. So really re-explaining what is at stake on climate and biodiversity, the link with Article 29 and the link with the methodology. There is everything about providing the data. So basically it's the subsequent data ISIN by ISIN provided in an Excel format. There is the reporting, which is the PDF of 90 pages for climate and biodiversity. And at the end, there is the Q&A part after the presentation of the different results to really make sure that everything is clear for you and to hear your feedback as well on this part. So about the Article 29, that will be it. And we'll now continue about the TNFD pilots with the presentation of Julie and of course with the feedback of Sandrine on the other side of the data, I will say, on the financial institution side.
Thank you, Melissa. So yeah, for the TNFD pilots, I will present to you the methodology, what we did, etc. And then I will let Sandrine talk about her feedback on this experience with Amundi. So just a bit of context to start. So the TNFD pilots, the idea of these pilots was to apply the TNFD beta framework on companies and portfolio of the sector agriculture and fisheries in Europe. So we conducted these pilots in the start of 2023. So it was not the final version of the TNFD. We were really in a beta framework, so version 0.2 and 0.3. So the idea was to test, for example, the LEAP approach at 2 different levels, so both company and portfolio level, to study what's currently feasible for companies and financial institutions using the different tools available and the different resources available to financial institutions. And at the end, the idea was also to report on challenges and limits for the TNFD in order for them to do their final version. So in terms of perimeter, we worked with, of course, between Carbon4 Finance and CDC Biodiversity, but we worked with 2 financial institutions, so Amundi Asset Management with Sandrine here today, and OFI Invest Asset Management. And for each financial institution, a portfolio of 10 companies of the sector was chosen with 1 focus company to see the difference between reporting on TNFD at portfolio level, and also reporting for the TNFD at company level. And finally, there is a publication from UNFI on this pilot, and you have the link here if you are interested after. So here I will present to you an overview of the methodology for the different phases of LEAP. So first, for the locate phase, we only applied this phase at company level because it is extremely difficult and time-consuming to do at company level, at portfolio level. And so the idea for this phase was to use both information from only public data, so annual reports, etc., and to go open these annual reports and see what informations in terms of locations are available publicly by these two companies that were chosen. And so we saw that in terms of scope 1 location, sometimes we have a little bit more of information, but for the agri-food sector, obtaining information on the upstream scope 3 locations was really difficult, especially because it's such a large value chain for the agri-food sector. And then with the locations that we were able to obtain, we used the IBAT tool to study really the biodiversity around the different sites. So for example, protecting areas, KBAs, etc. So this was the locate phase. Then for the evaluate phase, so I will present to you in a few slides some example of results. But the idea here for this phase was to test it both at company level and at portfolio level. And so we use the database BIA-GBS to calculate both impacts on biodiversity and dependencies on biodiversity. And I will show you a few results in the next slides. But then for the assess phase, so the search phase, the goal of this phase is to assess risks and opportunities of nature. So we applied this phase at company level, and we really did this phase in by two steps. So the first step was a qualitative assessment risk by risk, meaning that for each company, we really listed and identified risk by risk what were the relevant risks for this company and also opportunities. And then we qualitatively assessed their magnitude and their likelihood in order to obtain a risk materiality for this company. And so this was the first step. And the second step was a quantitative assessment of the risks. So we did a small-scale stress test for these pilots, and the goal was to obtain the decrease in turnover that these nature-related risks could lead to, but also the increase in costs for the company. So this was the assess phase. And finally, the prepare phase was less important for these pilots, but the idea was to conclude on what we were able to do for these pilots, to talk a little bit more about target setting, and finally, to do a gap analysis between the recommendations from the TNFD and what we were able to do for these pilots and what seems feasible for financial institutions at the beginning of 2023. So here you have an overview of all that we did for these pilots. And just as I said, we thought it was interesting to show you a few results that we are able to obtain during these pilots. So first, a little bit of context. We used the BIA-GBS database for these pilots, but we used the database with a bottom-up approach, meaning that currently, the database uses financial information and GHG emissions to calculate the impacts on biodiversity of companies. But for this pilot, we developed a bottom-up approach, meaning that we replaced financial data with inventory data. So we used only GHG emissions and final product quantities for these pilots, which allowed us a more important company-specific impact. And so this allowed us to produce graphs like this, for example. So here you can see a comparison of the different drink companies in the portfolios. So you can see here we have companies which produce distilled alcohol. We also have 2 beer companies and 2 soft drink companies. And so here you can see, so the horizontal axis is the quantity of product produced by this company. So more on the right means more products produced. The vertical axis is the impact intensity, meaning the impact of a company per ton of product. So higher on the axis means a higher impact intensity per ton of product. And finally, the size of the bubble is the overall impact, and so the total impact of a company. So a big bubble means a big impact, and a small bubble means a small overall impact. And so what we can see here is that really this bottom-up approach allowed us to differentiate companies within the same sectors. So these are all companies within the drink production sector, and we are able to differentiate the impact intensity of these different companies. And we can also see a tendency here that the distilled alcohols have a higher impact per ton of products than beers, and that the lowest impact per ton of product was the non-alcoholic drinks, which have a relatively low impact intensity. So this is a first example of what we can obtain using this bottom-up approach. We can also, this bottom-up approach also allows us to compare different products. And so here you have a graph which shows you the main impacts for different products. So the horizontal axis is the weight of the land use pressure in the total score, meaning companies on the right of this graph have a higher impact on land use. And the vertical axis is the weight of the what we call HT water pressure, which is the hydrological disturbance to the direct water use. So meaning companies that have a high impact due to water consumption and water withdrawal. And so the higher on this axis, meaning the higher impact you have on exploitation of resources and exploitation of water. And so, and finally, the size of the bubble is the overall intensity of the product. So a big bubble means a high impact intensity. And here you can see a few different products that we decided to show you today. So the idea is that some of these products have a higher impact of land use. And so these products are associated with a high land occupation, so, such as, for example, coffee, butter, etc. And on the other end, some products have a higher impact due to their water consumption and water withdrawals. So these are products associated with intensive water use, such as waters, algae, etc. And so finally, in terms of the size of the bubble, you can see that the biggest bubbles are products associated with animal production, for example, such as butters, etc., but also a high deforestation rate, such as vegetable oils, chocolate, coffee, etc. And finally, just to conclude on this methodological part, a few perspectives and lessons learned on our part. So I talked a little bit about this throughout the presentation, but here you have three main conclusions. So first, for the locate phase, so applying the locate phase to a listed equity portfolio is very time consuming, and there are a lot of challenges due to the accessibility of the data for the agri-food sector. But we showed that if you have this data and you have the time, there is an existing methodology to start addressing the challenge. For the evaluate phase, so I talked a lot about this, but it was the opportunity for us to test the bottom-up approach for the agri-food sector. And so this allows to evaluate the impact on biodiversity of the industry and to differentiate between different products. And finally, for the assess phase, we were really concluded that it was important to have this both approach, so both a quantitative approach, but also a qualitative approach to analyze the level of exposure of risks and probability of occurrences of risks at company level, because for now to do this really exposure analysis at quantitatively is very difficult. So a qualitative analysis can really help to start with the TNFD framework. And so now that I'm done with the methodology, I'm sorry there is a problem on the slide, but we have a feedback by Sandrine from Amundi. If you want to talk a little bit more about what were the main conclusion and the main feedback that you had on these pilots, but also what's next for Amundi in this framework.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. So I'm here with my colleague, Marie-Alix. So she has been participating to this working group from the beginning, and she might be able to answer some specific questions if needed. So at Amundi, the TNFD task force has contributed significantly to supporting existing initiatives, playing key role in amplifying and accelerating effort to onboard Amundi around this project. So big thanks to CDC Biodiversité for their outstanding contribution during this working group. So despite the evident value of quantifying impact and applying the TNFD framework, one of the biggest challenge for implementing this framework is the lack of standardized metrics and methodologies for ensuring or for measuring and reporting on nature-related risks and opportunities. So the pilot work actually demonstrate the feasibility of identifying potential impacts and opportunities. And it also allowed us to see concretely how to identify dependencies and also how the materiality can be taken into account. So, however, there's a need of, let's say, in-depth analysis at the company level, drawing from disclosures, report, and external sources. So at Amundi, the introduction of TNFD has provided our portfolio manager with a better comprehension of pertinent issues, facilitating internal discussions. Our ESG scoring methodology, for instance, incorporate nature-related factors such as direct exploitation of natural resources, water management, responsible forest management, paper recycling, pollution, etc. And today, we are in the process of defining a framework for integrating biodiversity issues into our investment policies aligned with the TNFD. So the framework is built around 4 main pillars. The first one is avoid. So this pillar is at company level, and it's about avoid investing in companies and activity with a strong negative impact on biodiversity or involved in controversial activities related to biodiversity. The second pillar is to reduce. So this pillar is applied at portfolio level, and it's about minimizing negative impact on biodiversity by investing in companies that are trending down their portfolio footprint. So here, typically, we use data from BIA-GBS and other internal and external sources to monitor the portfolio biodiversity footprint, for instance. The third pillar is called favor, and it's about protecting biodiversity and let's say natural ecosystems by investing in companies with good biodiversity practices or companies with a share of revenue contributing to biodiversity restoration. And the last and the most important pillar is engagement. So our ESG analysts engage with companies to support them in achieving biodiversity goals by taking into account the principle of double materiality. This is really important. So they do not only engage with company, let's say with main contributor to biodiversity loss, but they also engage with companies with high dependency on biodiversity. So to conclude, I would say one of the other main challenge to implementing the TNFD framework is the need for greater collaboration and coordination between different stakeholders, including financial institutions, companies, government, and even so, let's say civil society organization. And overall, the successful implementation of the TNFD framework will require a concerted effort from all stakeholders, as well as ongoing monitoring and evaluation to ensure that it's achieving its intended goal. So that's what we can say as a feedback for Amundi.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. It was really interesting to see so what were the consequences of this work for you and what you are planning to do next with your 4 pillars, etc. So it's really interesting, I think, for us, but also for other financial institutions in the room to see what they can do and what's the strategy of Amundi for the following, for the next part. Yeah. And so, yeah, for the last 10 minutes of this webinar, we have a little time for a Q&A. So do not hesitate to, I don't know if you can ask them in the chat or if you can just raise your hand, etc. So we can answer to some questions. Oh. Mm. And so if you have, do not hesitate if you have some questions for Melissa, for me, but also for Sandrine and for Amundi, just more broadly on what they did, what they are planning to do, etc. We will be happy to answer them.
Maybe we were too much clear on the presentation. So I think that if you have any other question, you can still contact us per email and we'll be very pleased to answer to you. Thank you very much for connecting to this webinar. We have 2 other webinars coming in the next following days. One on NZBA with BPCE and one more globally on our climate methodology. So don't hesitate to look on LinkedIn. We specify the different dates and links. And I wish you a very nice afternoon to all of you and speak to you very soon. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sandrine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.